Okay, so this is going to be a lecture on achievement goal theory. It's a very important theory in relation to motivation in sports. You can see there's a couple of references which are useful for you. I think I managed to produce a little chapter on it back in 2008 in this book, which is okay. I think it's pretty comprehensive in terms of covering the fact that it's studied from a personality point of view, from an environment point of view, and we'll cover that as we come up, as we go along. But it's very important and it's very influential. Not to say that it's the best theory, but it's one that we use a lot, which is very useful to be familiar with. So we're going to define achievement motivation in general, and the situations in which achievement motivation is a factor. And there are times in life where we're not motivated by trying to achieve something, so that's important to remember. We're going to look at a couple of the key theories which all appear to develop around the same time, and as a result may all have been encompassed into what we now call achievement goal theory. Look at the basic difference between what's called a task and an ego goal or type of goal. And just look at how, when we can measure those, the things which they're related to and linked to. Basic definition of motivation is the classic is the energization and direction of behaviour. So are you choosing to do something in particular? That's the direction. And are you energized in your pursuit of that goal? It's actually very hard to measure motivation directly. There's no device we can point at someone and say they're highly motivated, and in fact you can get people who are highly motivated, but it shows in terms of silent focus on a task as opposed to receiving energy and activation and raised heartbeats. So it's very hard to measure directly. We can infer it, as I've mentioned, by looking at the task someone chooses, the way they pursue that task, whether they stick with it after they've failed, and keep trying until they get the hang of it. But actually, it's very hard to measure directly. And what we find as we've studied motivation over the history of this topic is that we end up looking at the reasons why you're doing something as opposed to what you're doing or how you're doing it. And that's more informative, and that's enabled us to do a lot more study than trying to look at people and infer from that, or even measuring heart rate or pupil dilation. It's very hard to know that you're measuring motivation and not some other type of physical activation. So we've looked at the reasons behind the motivated activity, the goals that you are pursuing and why you're pursuing them, and that's become what we study when we refer to motivation. When we define the climate as well, the motivational climate will be the social and environmental structure around you, which is defining what you should and shouldn't do and how you should do it. And so it's usually either explicit in the rules or implicit in what's reinforced verbally and behaviourally and what people appear to approve of, and that appears to constitute a climate around the athlete or the person we're studying. So it's important to remember that with achievement goals, we're looking at achievement situations, things where there is an evaluation of your competence. So it could be a school situation, it could be sport. To some extent it can be exercise, but equally exercise is often at its most effective when it's examined as something you're doing without being evaluated. So if you're finding achievement goals being applied to something where there's no clear evaluation of competence, it probably, arguably, isn't an appropriate theory to be using. Other stuff links to achievement goal theory. We can look at how its concepts are reinforced through social structures, and we know that people can be motivated to pursue social goals, but achievement goals, in its strictest definition, should be applied to the evaluation of competence and not other stuff. It's a social cognitive theory, and what that means is as we progressed from studying just behaviour on its own, studying cognitions, and then how the cognitions are influenced socially, this comes in at the level of the social cognitive interaction. That's really what it means, and it looks at the interaction between social context and the person's way of thinking. So achievement goals really comes down to how we define competence, how it's evaluated and reinforced, as I said. Now, there's evaluation, there's often some form of competition, there's some level of skill or proficiency being tested, and there's usually a level of challenge in the task, so it's not an easy task where you can't demonstrate skill over and above somebody else, or you can't demonstrate improvement. So in an achievement situation, you're looking to demonstrate competence, or, and this is important, avoid demonstrating incompetence. So for any reason, we'll get to that, you don't want to show that you're incompetent at the task or skill. So the two core types of goals in classic achievement goal theory are called task goals and ego goals. Carol Dweck had a similar theory which ran alongside this for a while, and then perhaps has departed company a bit, where they were called mastery goals instead of task, and performance goals instead of ego goals. And it becomes clearer once we've described what those words mean as to why they're called those things. So if you're evaluating competence, and we've all done it, where you look at the nearest people or person and go, well, am I better than him or her? And if it's a very neat shortcut for evaluating competence. If a task is really hard and there's 30 people doing it in a class and only one of you can do it, perhaps that's the best person at that task. And certainly when it came to progressing through the maths books at primary school and things like that, most of us would have used that shortcut, that heuristic. And it's neat, it works, but only for a one-off evaluation. So if you're looking to evaluate yourself compared to other people, that would be an ego approach to defining and evaluating competence. And it's always normative in the comparison to other people. So you're looking to rank and compare. And what that means is you're not looking at your own development compared to last time. You aren't looking at whether you're achieving a set level in relation to perhaps a goal that you've set. You're not looking at the process you've gone through or the effort exerted. They all come under mastery goals. Performance is very black and white. You're looking to evaluate, and the only thing you would add to that is, where possible, you'd like to not only compare well by winning, but look even better by not exerting effort. So if you can win and win easily, then that's the sort of the perfect definition of high competence under an ego goals approach. Hopefully you can see straight away that's quite a fickle, fragile approach, because there's always going to be someone eventually who comes along who's better. And in a team of, in a race between 8 people, only one can win. In a race to get to the top of a profession, only one theoretically can win out of many hundreds or thousands. So it's a very fragile and very fickle, unreliable approach. And if your whole self-esteem depends on achieving and comparing well, that's quite risky. In contrast, if you can build from the ground up and go, well, hard work and effort leads to improvement, and improvement leads to measurable performance levels, and if I'm hitting those levels, perhaps I'll get the results in the end, then we're looking more at a mastery approach. So it's always reference to yourself or some objective measurable standard, and not some moving goalpost in terms of whoever's the person I want to beat or not lose to. And that's an important distinction, so if it's worth pausing here and just playing that slide again, it's potentially a good investment of a few minutes. So as this developed, we looked at kind of the basic desire, when it was conceptualized as a need, the need to achieve. It hasn't really stuck as a concept, as a theory, but this focus on evaluating competence, and in particular the need for success and the fear of failure, still persist. And actually when Nichols referred to demonstrating competence or avoiding demonstrating incompetence, that's an important difference, which for a long time, for maybe 15-20 years, was forgotten in achievement goals as we focused on task versus ego. And recently it's been re-emphasised by some work by Andy Elliott in America. It's caused some controversy, but It's at least conceptually it makes a degree of sense, and it seems to help some people understand the concepts better. The way we break it down is to look at the trait level within the person and their general tendencies, to look at the environment, and then to assume that those two things interact to produce a momentary type of goal involvement. So you're either in the moment more invested in an ego approach and being competitive, or more invested in development and working on skill improvement and effort. At the personality level, we've managed to show that you can be both. However, when it comes to climate and when it comes to immediate momentary involvement states, it's not clear. Presumably, theoretically, at the involvement level, you'd be one or the other and not both. So, we've managed to define achievement goals and look at how we're only applying that in achievement situations. And school and sport are perfect. Exercise, it depends. It's possible to evaluate competence, but there's other stuff going on. And we've managed to establish that it's the quality and the type of the way motivation is being regulated, the type of regulation. And in this theory, that comes down to a mastery concept of competence, or an ego concept of competence. Now, about the same time as this theory was being born in America, I think it was Illinois, there was a conference where the guys all met and agreed to their approach. There was also the idea of, within school, why some children, why do they exhibit this helpless pattern where they just give up and don't try? And why the children, even with equal ability, respond differently when they're challenged with tasks. And this was a different approach, which actually led us in a very similar direction and led to some kind of, perhaps some friction between the two theories, because they were addressing very similar concepts. In Dweck's theory, which is closely related to achievement goals, we hit upon the idea of implicit theories of ability. So, undeclared, unannounced, not necessarily verbalized or even something you're aware of, how does the person believe ability should act? If ability is believed to be set in stone and unchangeable, like some people believe intelligence and IQ tests are, or the number of fast twitch fibers or things like that, if they're unchangeable or relatively unchangeable, we have an entity conceptualization, and it's fixed and it isn't changing. What that would mean is, when it came to evaluating competence, you really have one shot. You get a score and perhaps compare it to the next person, and that's it, it's over. There's no point doing it again, you'll get the same score again, because it's unchangeable. Now, the other way of looking at ability is to say, well, it's improvable. I can get better at this, I can practice, and that would be an incremental approach to the idea of ability. And there are obviously many situations in life where that's the case. However, if you give somebody a novel task, like the steady hand game where you follow a piece of metal along and it beeps if you hit the sides, or intelligence tests and things like that, if you tell someone that it's an entity, unchangeable skill which is going to stay the same regardless, what you see is that they have one go and then give up. And one of the things they used to do, which seems quite silly, but it was a nice little test, was just to leave the room and leave them for 10 minutes and see what they did. And the people who had been told it wasn't going to change would sit there and twiddle their thumbs and wait to be told they could go. People who'd been told it's incremental, you can get better at this, would keep practicing. Especially, for example, if there was an extra test at the end. So one at the beginning, one at the end, and a weirdly long gap in between. The people who'd been told you can get better, perhaps unsurprisingly, would practice. And you can see how that would lead, if you believe ability is changeable and improvable, then you would practice more and you would pursue improvement and you would exert effort and you would see effort as a valuable thing in itself without necessarily immediately producing results. So perhaps as a pattern of motivation, it's already becoming clear that that's a more useful approach, because it's more likely to persist after failure and more likely to keep you motivated. Now, when it comes to the conceptions of ability, we had a questionnaire, very simple, but these are the types of questions you would ask. So, is learning an ability? Can it improve and change? And it's a fairly simple questionnaire. Perhaps we could invent some more, given the importance of this concept. But this just gives you an insight into how we study the nature of ability and how people's implicit, undeclared beliefs might be accessed. So, to try and sketch it out, if you believe that your ability in this particular task is fixed and unchangeable, you're more likely to want to just compare it to other people, get your level, and move on. So if you compare well, great, you'll behave, you'll keep going and compare yourself to anybody who comes along because, hey, I expect to do well here. If it turns out that you compare badly and you don't win very often and you tend to lose, well, you'll stop, you won't enjoy it, and you won't practice or do anything about it because it's not changeable. It can't be improved. So you can see how that pattern would stitch together. And then likewise, if you did believe it was changeable, regardless of whether you compared well or badly or performed well or badly, you would probably keep investing effort and time and looking to set increasing goals for yourself because it's improvable and changeable. So that's more likely to produce a more adaptive, more positive pattern of behaviour, and we would call that the mastery approach, the mastery pattern. Now, the book chapter I've written and another review that's coming out hopefully quite soon link achievement goals to a number of other things, and they can be linked in terms of the personality level and the environmental level. It's worth noting early in this, when we measure the environment around someone, we don't measure the environment, we measure what they believe the environment is, which is fine because that's obviously what's influencing their behaviour, but it doesn't actually tell us about the environment. So if you have one coach and 20 kids, their opinions will vary very widely, and that's an important point. However, when people either already have this as a personality trait or the environment they believe reinforces task and ego goals, that can be linked to emotional states, so positive emotions, negative emotions, which is called affect. The way you approach the situation, whether you're prepared to cheat or not, whether you think it's okay to foul other people and injure other people. It can even be linked to the rate of motor learning, whether you use particular mental skills. So it's lots of things appear to be linked. However, most of the studies you'll see here, and again the review that I'm trying to publish right now reinforces this, it's only correlational evidence. So research methods, day one, lesson one, should tell you correlation is never automatically causation. It's one of the conditions of causation, but actually until you can say I change this and I produce this outcome, the chances are you can't infer causation. But we do know that when people experience this pattern or have this personality trait, they tend to experience either a good or a bad motivational pattern. And that's moderated by whether they're performing well or badly. As I say, you can be ego involved and performing well, and you look very motivated. It's only when you start to struggle and compare badly you have issues. So the pattern is generally that if you're task orientated, you'll believe that effort produces success. You'll generally feel competent anyway because you're always managing to tick some box. You'll generally feel happy and not feel bad. If you're ego orientated, you're more likely to be motivated by competition, and as long as you're doing well at that, then you'll feel great. But if that's also linked to aggression, intentionally injuring other people and so on, because I want to win, and that's all that matters here. So very, very quickly, I guess, ego goals tend to associate to a more negative pattern, or you could also say they don't predict good things very often. It's unreliable how they predict good things, because the people who aren't performing well don't have that pattern. Whereas very reliably, task and mastery goals do tend to predict good things. And the whole moderating variable here is perceived competence. If you feel you're good, wonderful. If you feel you're bad, that's when having ego goals can become a problem. As I've mentioned earlier, we talk about the motivational climate, and it can and it perhaps should mean the objective, measurable surroundings. However, at the moment we use questionnaires to very broadly work out whether a person sees a more ego-involving or more task-involving climate. And we sometimes look at whether it's created by, in inverted commas, the coach or the parents or the peer group. But again, the words don't always, in the questions, don't always specify a coach, so perhaps we've missed a trick there. So, to match the trait personality level, we have exactly the same two types of concept, the mastery or task approach and the performance or ego approach. And there's a nice diagram just to try and illustrate it. You can have your orientation level measured by questionnaires such as the TOSC, Task Ego Orientation in Sport questionnaire, the environmental conditions, perceived motivational climate in sport questionnaire version 2. Other ones obviously exist, and those should combine to produce some involvement state. Now, it doesn't matter what you use to measure them, they're both just questionnaires. That should be happening anyway. That's the idea. And of course, your involvement level determines how you behave and what we actually see as a motivational pattern of engagement. Going back, way back to the beginning, the things that should lead to perceptions of a mastery climate can be, broken down into target, T-A-R-G-E-T, tasks that are challenging and diverse and engage everybody, offering choices rather than being bossy and in charge, recognising individuals for their effort and in private rather than perhaps embarrassing them in public, grouping people into mixed groups so they can learn off each other, and evaluating for effort and improvement rather than for normative comparisons. And you would give everybody time to learn. So that would be a positive environment that should lead to perceptions of a mastery climate. In contrast, if you did have tasks that were only allowed the top people to succeed, if you did set up a hierarchy structure where you're at the top and then your best players, the ones who appear to do best, are captain and so on, that would lead to quite a hierarchical structure and reinforce the idea that normative comparison is best. If your recognition was in public and very open and it was focusing on normative comparisons, again, that would reinforce the idea that we are comparing each other here. If you group people according to who's the best and who's the worst, of course, that would do the same thing. If you evaluate on normative comparisons and rank people all the time, or perhaps display results on boards, that's another way of reinforcing the competitive approach. And if you only give enough time on a task so that your best 2 or 3 athletes can get the hang of it or perform and the rest never get a chance to actually succeed, that might also have the same effect. This target framework is very popular, but it's largely been forgotten in the questionnaires that we use. And only recently have we started to try and observe the objective climate again. So, in the questionnaire, we see instead that in a mastery climate, people would perceive that effort is rewarded and cooperation with others is rewarded. Everyone feels that they have some important role, whether it be as a first team player or as a development player to push those first team players. And mistakes in particular, rather than being a problem, are viewed as part of learning. If we're looking at a comparative climate, then we would say only the best people get praise and rewards. There's rivalry and competition, and that's set up by the coach, I would imagine, in this particular version of the questionnaire, and mistakes are not acceptable. We want people to perform well all the time. So, just to show you how these climate perceptions measured by questionnaires predict lots of stuff, I've got 2 slides from the book chapter I showed you a minute ago, just showing the sorts of things that they link to. Don't be scared by it, it's just a dense slide to show you how much stuff, as much resources have been devoted to this area. So 5 studies linking the beliefs about what makes people successful in sport. They're saying, okay, well, if you're more perceiving a task climate, you'll believe that effort leads to success. If you perceive an ego climate, you'll believe that it's raw ability and possibly deception or gamesmanship. And lots of studies make these links about what's the point of sport, what makes you feel good or how good do you feel, how happy or sad do you feel. Lots and lots of studies invariably using questionnaires, invariably then doing correlation analysis, even if it's a more complex form of correlation analysis where they do structural equations and it flows from left to right, it's still only correlations. And the flow from left to right is actually our theory, our expectation of what should happen, not what's actually happening. And that's again worth bearing in mind. But there's lots of studies all showing these links. And what that means is it's definitely worth then seeing if we can cause these changes and cause a change in the perception of the climate, which then leads to some positive change. But we don't do that. We just look at these two things happen to coexist. Oh well, move on. So being critical for a second, our chapter tried to do it. The upcoming review might make some of these same points. We tend to be very generous with achievement goal theory. Theories should make falsifiable predictions and we should test those. And actually what we rarely ever do is actually test achievement goal theory with a view to breaking it and seeing where it breaks and fixing that, because that's how progress is made. Instead, we set out to support the theory and expand its applicability and apply it in more and more situations, which isn't necessarily the same thing as doing proper science. And where a problem exists, we just take another theory and plug the gap. So self-determination theory is a favourite, and I'll show you that in a different lecture. And so having tighter definitions and allowing it to make predictions that could be proven wrong is important, because that's how progress occurs as theories evolve. And this theory hasn't evolved for perhaps 20, 30 years. And we actually allow it a lot of wiggle room and allow what I call yeah buts and what ifs. So we almost allow these escape routes when it appears to be experiencing trouble in its predictions. We use these complex stats, but they're not good complex stats. They're often just forcing data to look like the theory is doing what it should, whereas you could apply a different theory to the same data and get a similarly convincing pattern from left to right across the page. So again, we should be setting out to actually test this now. We have the hypothetical links between these two things appear to be associated. We should be testing that, not just correlating it still. And in that respect, you could say, well, achievement goals has become a classic Kuhnian paradigm, to refer to Thomas Kuhn, who was a philosopher of science, whereby it's not allowed to be broke, it's not allowed to be tested to breaking point. And if you find a problem with it, it's not the theory that was wrong, it was you did it wrong. And that's an interesting way of looking at it, but as far as I can see in the literature right now, no one tries to break or tries to find problems with achievement goal theory. With regard to climate, I would imagine there's a lot more going on than just task and ego stuff in a climate. We mentioned at the start that you can reinforce social connections, you can want to be involved in stuff just to be part of a group and to connect with people. And again, talking about sort of shoehorning and fudging ideas together, at the moment those nice social things are linked to a task climate because task climates are nice. I think we can do better than that, and I think it's possible to find yourself fitting into a team because you're really competitive and so is that team. And I don't necessarily think that it's automatically wanting to belong means that you're going to perceive a task climate or find yourself in a task climate. And we only measure them in very generalised terms. We don't look at the exact things that the coaches and teammates and parents are doing to create the perception of a particular climate. We just say, in general, over the last 6 months, how do you perceive things are going? And that loses a lot of accuracy and detail. When it comes to motivational climate, achievement goals currently dominates. There's only really a couple of other approaches that even get close, and even that's only very recently. So it's at the expense of other theories, and those theories could be contributing meaningfully to our understanding. So when you say motivational climate, everyone thinks you mean achievement goals. There must be other stuff. And so in my papers I've tried to refer to motivational atmosphere sometimes as being a bigger, broader concept that includes more different ideas. So I think I always try and encourage you to be critical of these theories, and that's my attempt to guide you in that. Some key readings for you, classic references in this area. I hope that's been a useful introduction. There's plenty of books and chapters out there for you, and I can point you to some of the more helpful ones depending on the problem that you are trying to solve. But in the meantime, I hope that's a good start, and I'll speak to you again soon.